So welcome to today's PAVE virtual panel. Today we continue Pedestrian Safety Month with a virtual panel, How do AVs see pedestrians? Of all of the technical challenges that fully autonomous vehicles face, reliably detecting pedestrians and cyclists and predicting their behavior is one of the toughest. Luckily, today we have some really great experts who will be discussing the techniques and technologies being used to develop AVs and provide protection for vulnerable road users. My name is Tabitha Coulter, and I'm PAVE's Director of Operations and the moderator for today's panel. I'll introduce our guests really quickly, and then we'll go ahead and get started with the conversation. Our first guest is Sam Anthony, co-founder and CTO at Perceptive Automata. Sam, great to have you with us.
Thanks for having me.
Our second panelist is Matthew Weed, Director of Product Strategy at Luminar. Matthew, wonderful to have us with you today, and thank you for stepping in for Aaron Jefferson, who was originally listed as our Luminar panelist.
Absolutely. Hopefully I'll be able to fill his shoes.
And finally, we have Kevin McNamara, CEO at Parallel Domain. Kevin, thank you for joining us.
Hi, everybody. Good to be here.
All right, jumping straight into the questions now, I want to start at a very high level and bring you all in for this first question. So starting with Kevin, what are some of the characteristics of pedestrians that make them such a challenge for autonomous vehicles?
And we typically focus on the on the perception and vision side of the problem for detecting and tracking pedestrians. So that often means that we'll approach this by breaking the problem into two different categories. One is detection, and one is either tracking or prediction. So the idea of how do we initially detect a pedestrian at a given point in time, but then also how do we track that pedestrian through a dynamic scene and also maybe predict what they're going to do so that we can make decisions based on what they're doing. There are big challenges in both of those categories, and I'm super excited to dig into both of them. But I would say, there are challenges in initial detection that typically have to do with how well can we see that pedestrian at a given point in time? Is it nighttime? Is there rain? Is there fog? Is that pedestrian occluded? Are they moving quickly? Are they far away? So maybe it's hard for the sensors to see them. Those can typically be problems in initial detection. But then in tracking and prediction, we get into a lot of the problems that some of the folks here on the call deal with, especially Perceptive Automata, which is how do we predict what those pedestrians are going to do? Are they going to cross the street? Are they going to jump out from behind a car? Can we track them through occlusions? And I know we've got some questions coming up that go deeply into some of those topics. But I think on the tracking side of things, it really has to do with unpredictability, right? So with detection, it's often how well can we see that person or thing initially? How good is the light? How close are they to the vehicle? Can we actually see the full object? But then in tracking and prediction, it often comes down to how well can we predict what they're going to do? And I think a lot of us know people tend to be extremely unpredictable and do crazy things, and that makes it really hard.
Absolutely. Sam, anything to add there?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that where this all starts, right, is that autonomous vehicles see pedestrians really differently than human drivers see pedestrians. Human drivers see pedestrians as other people, and we can say, yeah, people are unpredictable, but also we know a lot about them. When I see a pedestrian, I can say, oh, if I was a pedestrian, this is what would be in my head. If I was a pedestrian, this is what I would be expecting out of the vehicle I'm in. When an autonomous vehicle sees a pedestrian, it sees, an object like other objects, and it can kind of apply characteristics to that object. But fundamentally, it's a really different set of information that the autonomous vehicle has. And so it means not only that autonomous vehicles have different problems than humans do in terms of understanding pedestrians in the world, but also that it's really hard to have an intuition for those problems because we as humans are so good at looking at somebody and kind of understanding things about them.
Yeah. And Matthew, could you compare the pedestrian safety challenge with maybe other technical challenges on that critical path for AV deployment?
Yeah, and I'll try to flavor this from not the vision perspective, because I feel like Sam and Kevin have a lot of that mentality, and Luminar presents 3D sensing through LiDAR. I think this idea of the nuance behavior of humans is really I think Sam nailed it right on the nose there. That's the hard part. We leverage tremendous amount of insight into understanding how they move. From a sensing perspective, a 3D sensing perspective, like from LiDAR, how Luminar sees the world. The part that's interesting is that we can understand exactly what's happening in that third dimension. If there's motion that's happening in the third dimension that's subtle, we can inform better prediction models potentially based on the actual kinetic dynamics of the person. We did some work back in 2018 with Volvo on this topic, trying to track effectively the skeletons of people based on their 3D motion, which is for this complicated the topic of predicting the motion of people is a valuable piece. Comparing that to like cars, for example, or even a walking pedestrian versus a cycling one, the real challenge is the degrees of freedom that they have to move. It's very, a car moves relatively predictably all the time. Bicycle slightly less predictably, but still pretty linear. And then a human can do whatever the heck they want in 6 degrees of freedom or more. And so I think the way Luminar likes to think about pedestrians is contributing to the deeper prediction models and providing that safety layer. We'll probably talk about this more, but LiDAR doesn't need to know what the heck the thing is to be able to assess it as a threat for collision, which is a really valuable part of LiDAR.
Absolutely. And Kevin, you
can just Tabitha, one thing I would say to about what Matthew was saying, I don't think I implied this, but when I say that AVs see pedestrians really differently than humans do, in some ways they struggle, but in some ways they can see humans much better. And I'm sure Matthew will talk about that because I think that his technology really enables that. But it's not better or worse in any sort of global way. It's just really different.
Yeah, I'd agree. We leverage intuition with very little data, right? The car has tons of data, but no intuition, right? It's a very different perspective. I agree, Sam. Yeah, well put.
And thinking about that different perspective, actually, Kevin, you were mentioning briefly in your first answer about environmental factors. So I'd love to have you talk a little bit more about that on, how environmental factors affect AV's ability to detect or predict pedestrians, and how AVs are overcoming those challenges and what, you all at Parallel Domain are trying to do in that area.
Yeah, I love to talk about this one because one of our core backgrounds as a company is generating lots of these virtual environments in which different scenarios and situations can happen, and then vehicles can learn to perceive, people or cars or objects in those environments. And so a big part of the importance of environmental factors, I think, is the diversity of situations that you'll end up encountering and what those pedestrians are going to do in those situations. So for example, if you have a crosswalk, people are going to act differently around that crosswalk. They're going to cross it, or they might jaywalk, but they might do that at a higher concentration near a crosswalk. If you have a crosswalk near an intersection versus halfway down a road with what you'd call hawk lights, and people are going to be doing different things in those situations. And so at Parallel Domain, we often look at how do we source the wide variety of different situations that happen in the world environmentally, from crosswalks, intersections, overpasses, parking lots and schools, and all these different areas, bus stops where people are doing things or walking around in a certain way. How do we source that from the real world? Through maps, through satellite imagery, through customer data. And then how do we have our systems reconstruct environments where those things can then go happen virtually, and we can replay them over and over again with lots of different variations and lots of different corner cases happening. And once we have that variety in environments where pedestrians can find themselves in a variety of situations, we can then layer over that things like time of day and things like weather and things like different clothing combinations and different actions on top of those pedestrians that give us this sense of, hey, having data for a pedestrian jaywalking is very helpful, but we really want that pedestrian jaywalking at 20 different times of day in different amounts of rain, different amounts of fog, potentially different amounts of snow as well. And we think about those environmental factors as really being a part of the domain or the problem space in which we need to perceive pedestrians. And to Matthew's point, we very much see our mission as improving autonomous perception. So we are not only about computer vision, I'd say actually more than half of our business is through generating LiDAR data for customers. And so that combination of LiDAR sensors and camera together is potentially what's going to allow you to see those pedestrians at night. And maybe when you factor in other sensors, potentially seeing through bad weather or perceiving pedestrians in different tough environmental conditions. So maybe I would summarize that answer as, we look at the environmental factors as we have to cover the variety of what we could see in the real world so that we can make better and more holistic training data for these systems.
Yeah, that's a really great answer. Matthew, I know you also touched on this a little bit, but what are some of those unique challenges about detecting pedestrians in, maybe some of those most important tools in how to improve an AV's ability to detect pedestrians?
Yeah, I think and I think Kevin hit on this a little bit from a environment and scenarios, but it's also um, most of the times in which it's difficult and maybe even most dangerous and necessary to detect and predict behavior of humans on the road or near the road is when they're partially occluded. There's the old joke of a person climbing up out of a manhole cover, but there's a lot more common of a thing like somebody standing behind a car waiting to cross. And these are scenarios in which machine learning from camera vision struggles because you may not have good, as long as the sensor is trained to see a half a person, then maybe they're able to predict it. It's motion a little bit more, but I think one of the things that's a real interesting challenge for all the sensors is to be able to be robust to those different ways in which a human presents themselves. People wearing different clothing, my neighbors have 5 kids, and there's every type of wheeled vehicle possible in that garage, and whether it be a hoverboard or a tricycle or a tandem bicycle or a pogo stick, right? People present themselves in all kinds of weird ways, and so I think that's probably the biggest challenge of detection is to be robust to the infinite possibilities of the way they present, which is why one of the things that Luminar really sees as a huge potential, particularly with LiDAR, is to have very deterministic as well as machine learning based approaches to processing the data. It's very difficult to do a lot of the more deterministic stuff with cameras because there's just so many color contrast variables. It's difficult to have rules based detections that are really robust. But with LiDAR, everything's 3D structures, right? They're clusters of points. And so, again, like I mentioned before, assessing the threat is really the way we like to think about these objects, whether they be classified appropriately as pedestrians or not, has more to do with the predictive behavior. So this, and that may be kind of a way to think about the difference between safety systems versus autonomy systems, right? Safety systems benefit from prediction, but autonomy systems need to be predicting all the time because they're doing the real-time driving. So detecting pedestrians is a tricky thing for a number of reasons. And I think that it really goes to the huge variety of ways in which they present themselves in front of sensors is the biggest thing there.
A big +1 there, Matthew, to the occlusions problem. Partially occluded objects are really tough in perception in general. And this can go for cars, people, bicycles, and whatever they be. I'll take this as a moment to shameless plug some research that Toyota Research did on top of our data, where they were able to set a new state of the art in multi-object tracking through occlusions, right? And it's a huge benefit of synthetic data where we can have pedestrians and bicyclists and cars moving through environments at really high concentrations, moving behind and in front of each other. But because this is a synthetic simulation, we know exactly where that pedestrian was all the way through the sequence, whether it was fully occluded or not. And being able to generate that type of data, we found both LiDAR and camera data tracking those pedestrians all the way through that occlusion. Toyota Research was able to actually train models then that could track and predict the motion of those objects much more reliably when deployed out into the real world. So we've just want to echo that. We've also seen tracking objects and especially people through occlusions as a really hard problem and something that we're focusing a lot on.
Yeah, I'll echo the echo on that one. I think it's one of the problems our perception team really focuses, spends a lot of time on is on highway, there's a lot of, especially small vehicles, there's a lot of trucks around. You'll lose a car completely from your line of sight for many frames. And the ability to track, start to predict, and think about, again, the 3D world of that sensing is a really a strong pointer in the direction of progress, because you can pick back up that car and connect and close loop that tracking because of that 3D environment, because of tools like what Kevin described, being able to actually create and explore these kinds of edge cases of occlusions or partial detections or weird edge cases that could trick your system. Yeah,
exactly that problem of like object permanence, right? And this
yeah.
is you're driving as a human, you're driving down the highway, and you know that that little car is still on the other side of the tractor trailer because you saw it a minute ago, and you'll remember it's there and that it's going to come back into view at some point. But historically, machine learning algorithms haven't been great at object permanence, and typically most machine learning algorithms will forget that object exists fairly shortly. And that was exactly part of the research that Toyota did, was introducing much longer, much more reliable object permanence, that even if something does go behind that occlusion, the system can remember it was there, try to estimate where it's going to appear again, so that when it does appear again, it recognizes that as the same object and it had kind of tracked all the way through. So that's, yeah, this idea of object permanence with machines is a huge challenge, and something a lot of people are working on right now.
That actually segues perfectly to what my next question was actually, which is, so once the sensors detect the presence of a pedestrian, Sam, what does the AV need to do next? What does that system need to understand about the pedestrians, and why does that understanding matter so much?
Yeah, absolutely. And this really builds on the last question, right? Because one of the reasons these questions of occlusion and of tracking, they're incredibly difficult sensor challenges. But it's even trickier when you're talking about a pedestrian or a human-driven vehicle, because that pedestrian or that human-driven vehicle has expectations in return. So when somebody is coming out from behind a car, they very much have a sort of theory in their head about what you know about them, about when you see them, and they are both acting on that theory and sort of expecting to get kind of confirmation that you know about that. Right? So if you have an AV and the AV detects that pedestrian late and then kind of slams the brakes, a situation where a person would expect the AV to not only have already identified them, but understand that they want to cross the road, then that introduces all kinds of failure modes in the behavior of the vehicle. Like you can get into sort of, these oscillation kind of situations where the vehicle stops too late and then the person eventually starts to go and the vehicle kind of starts to go. So there's really this mismatch between what the pedestrian thinks that the vehicle knows and the vehicle actually knows, that can lead to what's something that started out as an edge case from our perspective, getting into an even more dangerous situation. And so really what you need to think about is, well, how do people do this, right? And so first of all, as Matthew noted earlier, people are incredibly good at making these intuitive judgments from very limited data. Also, those intuitive judgments go far, far beyond just kind of knowing, this is a pedestrian versus a paper bag. This pedestrian is moving at this speed. For us at Perceptive Automata, that what we're really focused on is judgments of that pedestrian state of mind, right? So typically with computer vision, with all the best sensors in the world, what you're going to get is a description of a pedestrian that you can kind of think of as a black box, right? So there's a pedestrian and it's a person, but you don't really know anything about what a person is, and especially not what's in that person's head. You can tell their pose, you can tell their direction. Ideally, with the work, certainly with Luminar sensors, you can detect them hopefully very early on. You can maintain tracking, as Kevin was noting, with some of the more recent advancements, you're getting better at that. But then if you don't know what's in their head, it can be really, really hard, and in many common scenarios, impossible to really have a good understanding of what the person might do. So for instance, if there's a person emerging between emerging from between two parked cars, and that person was occluded and then is not occluded, you can detect them, but then is that person emerging from between those two cars because they're trying to cross the street and they want you to yield for them, or want to know if you're going to yield for them? Or are they emerging from between the two parked cars because they're going to get into one of those cars? And that's something where you have to know what's in their head, and knowing what's in their head is something that people do effortlessly. And so when I sort of talk about not treating people as a black box, it's really that. Can you have an intuition? Can you have a reliable judgment about what's in that person's head?
There's definitely been a theme, I think, of that element of randomness that comes along with pedestrians so far, especially in urban scenes where you could have, as you guys have mentioned, people coming between parked cars, children chasing balls, people walking home from bars, and so on. So Matthew, I'd like to ask you, how do you help assure safe AV performance in pedestrian scenarios like that during AV development?
Yeah, and this is a hot topic right now for us. Actually, at the IAA mobility event in Munich a few weeks ago, it's maybe 3 weeks ago now, it was one of the big focuses for Luminar is being able to do exactly that, the detection and emergency backup braking of a pedestrian jumping out from cover at kind of the last minute. And this is really the sweet spot for LiDAR sensing. Like I mentioned, I think LiDAR will contribute in a lot of ways to the predictive natures of pedestrians, but this safety envelope, what Luminar refers to as proactive safety, but this idea of being able to understand what's happening in the environment around the vehicle and create proactively potentialities of what should happen if the vehicle, whether it's human or autonomously controlled, doesn't react appropriately to some scenario, that there is that fallback, and we're doing kind of stopping emergency braking maneuvers up to rather high speeds, 80 kph, 50 miles an hour or so, with very little warning, no visibility to a small pedestrian dropping out. And that's the kind of thing that you can only really achieve if you have ultimate confidence in the assessment of something being collision worthy, regardless of its classification, whether it be a dog or a person. You probably don't want to go slam into it. And if it's safe to identify and brake for it, you should. It protects the whatever it is that came out in front of you. It protects your own vehicle, and doing that with confidence is a really important thing that the LiDAR gives you. So absolutely. And that's a really high priority for Luminar right now. Again, regardless of who's in control of the vehicle, whether it be a robot or me.
Absolutely. And Kevin, could you talk a little bit about ways that the industry is testing or validating pedestrian safety performance without endangering actual pedestrians?
Sure, and this makes is really relevant to the work that we do on the synthetic data side of things, because one of the big advantages to synthetic data is that we can generate both training and testing sets that you didn't have to go out and perform in the real world, right? To actually see what was going to happen. And so I love having the three folks that we have here today, actually, because we've got Matthew typically operates on the sensor side, which is like, how do we actually obtain information about the environment that's going to come into the brain of the car? And then we've got Parallel Domain that's here essentially augmenting and creating all the different situations in which those sensors could see things. And then we've got Sam's company with Perceptive Automata, which is saying, hey, once we have that sensor data into the brain, how do we deduce what is happening in the environment, what these people are going to do, what's inside of their heads? And so when we think about both training and testing or validation of these systems, a lot of the times what we're trying to do as a company is sit right in between the sensor and the kind of planning stack of the vehicle and generate lots of different situations, all the different things those sensors could have seen, all the different situations and environments that the car could have found itself in, so that the brain can then be tested and trained to deal with those things. We often operate on the side of actually augmenting training data. What we're finding is that synthetic data is extremely valuable for making perception systems. This is both camera, LiDAR, radar, all sorts of sensors. Synthetic data is extremely valuable for training more robust perception systems. And actually, a lot of our customers continue to use a combination then of real world and synthetic data for validation and testing. And what a lot of companies will do is they'll use real world data that they've already sourced, or they'll go out onto testing tracks and source specific scenarios to have a set of real world validation data. And they'll use that set of real world validation data to then say, hey, if we have a much, much, much larger body of synthetic data, can we correlate that the synthetic data in the situations that are similar to our real world data were similar enough for us to have confidence that when I see those situations in synthetic data, I'm going to perform the same or very similar to how I would have performed if that was actually real data. And so what we see a lot of customers doing is using a large amount of synthetic data to help train better systems, and then using real data to benchmark the testing and validation sets of those systems, and then using a synthetic data as like a much larger body to say, hey, if we've established confidence that the synthetic data works for testing these situations, we can then extrapolate and use synthetic data to add a lot more variety to the different tests that we're running. And we see that in many cases, synthetic data can allow customers to test and train for situations that they either haven't encountered or frankly don't want to encounter in the real world because they're too dangerous. And so we've seen people be able to gain a lot more confidence about how the system is operating before they actually put that thing out in the real world, which is really helpful.
That's really helpful. One other quick question we got from the audience was, are there different challenges when it comes to e-scooters and bikes versus pedestrians on their feet? Matthew, do you have anything to add on that topic?
I don't know, I probably already said it, right? All my neighbors and wheeled devices, they definitely present themselves weird. I think I don't have anything else to add, but maybe the others do.
Yeah, Kevin,
I mean, for us, it's really interesting because we're looking at the social cues that people present, right? And when somebody is on an e-scooter, first of all, the way they move is really different. But second of all, the ways that they think that they can interact with you and the ways that they expect you to want to interact with them really vary. And so you can't sort of generalize and say, oh, that's a person out in the world. I know what that means. If it's a pedestrian versus a cyclist versus a scooter, they really all have to, versus even a motorized wheelchair, they all have very different characteristics. And so for us, we really have to put together variant versions of our models to deal with all of these different categories, because they behave differently from the perspective of interacting with people.
I really like what you said there, Sam, is like they are a different class, right? Scooters are not bicyclists and they're not pedestrians. Like they really are a different class of road user, I guess is what we call them. But that means that, you really want to treat them differently, both from a detection. We were talking earlier about splitting the whole, perception problem into detection versus tracking and prediction. You want to treat them differently on both levels, right? I mean, a bike doesn't look exactly like a scooter and it doesn't look like a pedestrian. And so we want to separate those things out from our raw sensor data, trying to detect those objects in the first place. And then to Sam's point, scooters act very differently than bicycles. So when we're trying to predict what a scooter or a skateboarder or a one-wheeler is going to do, or a unicyclist, whatever it might be, they're all going to act and steer and drive and interact with other people differently. It's something we actually spend a lot of time working with our customers on, is we typically tend to focus on like the known unknowns, like stuff that we know exists, but we don't have enough data for it. Like we know that we don't have enough data of scooters, of bicyclists, of pedestrians, ambulances, people falling down in the middle of the road because they tripped. Like those cases are what we'd call corner cases, but they're the known unknowns. We know they happen, we know we need to deal with them, and we want more data for them. So scooters are a really perfect example of something that 10 years ago, they just weren't around, right? Motorized scooters were not really in cities. And so they weren't a class in our customers' taxonomy or hierarchy. There typically isn't a scooter class in most people's perception stack or their prediction stack. And so a lot of times what we help people deal with is scooters come onto the scene, one-wheel skateboards come onto the scene. With synthetic data, we can very quickly add those types of objects and those types of behaviors into the simulation, generate lots and lots of data of those things doing and behaving in a way that would align with that type of object. And then now we have a big data set that we can go train specifically for that class and actually introduce a new class into the hierarchy that says, hey, when you see this skateboard thing that only has one wheel, it actually steers differently, and the people on that operate differently. You'll find them in different situations. And so train for that differently and treat it as a unique class. I totally agree with that.
Well, I unfortunately just looked down and saw that we hit our 30-minute mark. This has been such a great conversation on, how AVs see and detect and predict pedestrians. So thank you so much to our experts, Sam, Kevin, Matthew. Thank you for your expertise in participating.
It was great. Went too fast.
Thanks for listening, everybody.
Absolutely. And a big thank you to our live audience, and especially those of you who submitted questions. If you'd like to follow up with PAVE or with one of the 3 panelists on this topic, please reach out to us via our website contact form or just reply to your registration email. We will be posting the full video recording of this on our YouTube channel and website later this afternoon. Follow us on any social media at PAVE Campaign to see that as soon as it's released, or go to our website at pavecampaign.org. Thank you all.